Welcome to the Pursuing Life podcast. I'm your host, Monica Kirsch, and today I am joined by David Harrop and Adam Darris, and we are going to be talking about the final Monday before Jesus' death and resurrection. And in this passage, we see two things happen. We see Jesus curse the fig tree, and then we see him overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple. So let's jump in. I would love to hear first what stood out to each of you as you read this passage with fresh eyes this week.
Well, for me, to answer that question specifically, what stood out was that Jesus went to see if there was fruit on the fig tree. And then the other account says that he knew it wasn't the season for figs. And so he's looking for something that he knows he's not going to find. And so in that lead into him going to the temple to find faith, I think he already knows, and he's seeing this in the fig tree, that he's coming to find something that just doesn't exist at the moment. It's not there. And it is his way of leading the disciples to look for faith and to begin looking at how they worship as compared to those in the temple that aren't really worshiping God. I just see a connection there that I'd never really seen before, that the two stories really go well together as opposed to being disjointed.
Yeah, and I think there's a key contrast that stands out to me as you jump right into this progression, because you see him coming in on a donkey, humbly, and you're expecting this king to come with force, and he comes in meekness and in gentleness. But then as he goes to the temple, it's not a coronation for a king. He goes in and we see this contrast of meekness and gentleness, and suddenly there's force being displayed. And he's flipping tables in the temple, and there's, I think, a clear contrast being drawn there. But then it continues in Matthew 21, and it says suddenly he's healing the sick and the lame in the temple. And so you've got this meekness, and you've got this force, and then you've got this gentleness on display again. I just think it's a really powerful contrast of the person of Christ we see in this progression.
I want to jump in on that too, because what struck me in that story was that it was a colt that had never been ridden before. Now, I'm not much of a donkey farmer, but I do know that must have been challenging. Can you imagine getting on a donkey that we usually think of as pretty wild or very sedentary, not moving, very hard to budge? Yet this one that had never been ridden before is what Jesus chooses to come into the city of Jerusalem on. And that just really struck me as a subtle nuance that perhaps people were seeing even in that Jesus had some authority that they couldn't quite figure out or didn't know how to reconcile. That here he is taking this colt that had never been ridden, and he's the one that's leading it into the temple, riding on it.
Yeah, and we see these continual glimpses of his authority. I mean, it's a great picture. And then we see his authority in the temple. And people have a tendency when they look at Christ, I'm not sure the story of him flipping tables in the temple is the image we always see on, frames in the home. It's not the story we're always told. We're looking at the miracles and the healings and focusing on his love and his gentleness. But he does have these glimpses of authority right away that we see through the triumphal entry the whole way through the temple and flipping the tables.
Which I could go on, but that's exactly where the scribes and priests jump in right after and start questioning, by what authority do you do these things? And so it's not 3 or 4 unrelated scenes. I think it's all this flow of Jesus showing his authority meekly and humbly, but then contrasting that with overturning tables in the temple that I think was his authority, that he had to do that.
Yeah, to your point, Adam, this is not a picture that we typically think of when we think of Jesus. So right off the bat, I think we need to kind of address the emotion that we're seeing here, because oftentimes we read into this text and we see and we assume Jesus is angry here. He's just so upset about what's happening in the temple. But can we just discuss what actually are we seeing when it comes to the emotion that Jesus is showing here, and what can we learn from it?
Anger isn't the issue, whether or not he was angry or not. I just don't think the text specifically says Jesus was angry. And Luke's gospel talks about this day and says Jesus was weeping over Jerusalem when he comes to this point. And so I do think it could be read with that kind of emotion too, that he's so saddened by what he sees in the temple, the lack of faith, the outward example of worship that everybody was comfortable with, that really wasn't honoring God or devoted to God. And so there is a part of me that says, I've always read it as saying, oh, he was angry. I've never overturned a table without being angry. And maybe I've never overturned a table.
You never flipped a game of Monopoly or anything?
Maybe, actually. But I also think maybe it was just him being teaching, because it says he was teaching in the temple. Maybe he was like wiping everything out as he was talking and as he was trying to explain. So again, it's just a subtlety that I found very, unique as I'm trying to read and wrestle with this as if I'm reading it for the first time.
I think when we tend to think about emotion, we tend to think about reactive, as if Christ is in some way like we are, and just he comes in and just emotion overtakes him and he's flipping tables in a rage. And no, I think it was intentional. I think it was proactive. I think he's making a point. And back to David's point about connecting it to the fig tree, the hearts of Israel were far from Christ. And I think he's coming in to start to create a picture of what ultimately is going to continue to happen in their lives and ultimately in the temple if they fail to worship him correctly. And so this wasn't an outburst of emotion that's uncontrollable. We know he doesn't sin, but I believe this is a proactive, intentional attempt to get their attention and, to your point, David, to connect it to his teaching, because he's in the temple many times that week. And so I think it was something that he was building on throughout the week.
And interestingly, when Jesus was angry in the other passage in Mark 3 and possibly here, it's always because of the things of God being not being understood or being done incorrectly, as people see what he's doing and don't respond to it well. And so that does create an emotion in him. I don't know whether it's sadness or anger, but it is this sense that people just don't quite get what he is about. And in that moment, he's trying to draw them back to himself.
Yeah.
The language used is zeal in the text.
Yeah.
So there is an emotion, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a sinful emotion of anger.
Right.
Yeah. What I think is super interesting here is we know that there were not only people selling things inside the temple, but there were also merchants outside of the temple. And here, Jesus really doesn't do anything with those who are outside of the temple. It's those who are inside of the temple that he is concerned about. So why is this? What can we learn from this emotion inside the temple as opposed to outside of it?
So this is where I put on my mission pastor hat. I hope you know that. But so when Jesus quotes from Isaiah 56, the thing that he's saying that sometimes we miss, if we take it in the whole of the context, he says, my house is supposed to be a house of prayer for the nations. And in that, he's saying we need to be welcoming the people that come from outside. And what I understand was happening was they would come from other places and then they didn't bring their animals for sacrifice with them, so they would have to buy animals. They would go to these money changers because the people selling the animals wouldn't accept their coins, their foreign coins. They'd have to buy temple coins and get a bad exchange rate, and then go and buy the animals with that bad exchange rate. And so here, instead of welcoming the people who were coming from afar, coming from outside of Jewish culture and worship, instead of welcoming them, they were making it more difficult for them. And that's just so convicting for me when I think about welcoming others, thinking about others, and even maybe the way that I view my worship and how others from the outside might see it. Am I really making sure that what I do and the way I serve God and seek to serve him is embracing of others that might have questions or misunderstandings about how I worship God?
Yeah, in many ways, I think these things are real issues, but they're symptomatic of a greater issue. And so it may have been the location in the temple. It may have been economic exploitation. I'm sure those things were happening to some extent. But Deuteronomy 14 makes it clear that it's okay to do money changing. That was expected. It's not the fact that they're exchanging money in some sense, but I think it's symptomatic of the greater issue, which is the heart of the people. And anytime I'm trying to understand a text like this, which there's only a few verses, I love your point of looking to these Old Testament texts. And he quotes Isaiah 56, and then he quotes Jeremiah chapter 7, where he talks about it being a den of robbers. And the context in Jeremiah 7, if I just read this verse quickly, because I think it's helpful, he's talking about the temple there. And he says, will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, only to keep going on and doing those abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? And then he says, hey, go look at Shiloh and see what I did to them, and you're going to see evidence of what happened the last time the people of Israel were evil in this way. And so that's really, really important, because he's connecting not just economic exploitation, not just these minimal symptoms of, this is an issue with the heart of the people of Israel, that they're far from God. That's the point he's making with the fig tree as well. And so when you get to Jeremiah 7, he's saying, you're doing all of these things, wicked in my eyes, but then you're coming and offering sacrifices. You need to be repenting of these things before you're coming and offering worship. And in Jeremiah 7, he destroys the temple not much longer when Babylon comes in. He says, go look at Shiloh. It's the same thing. That's where the temple of the Lord, the tabernacle of the Lord had been. It's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And they were destroyed completely back in 1 Samuel when they were disobedient. And so now again, he's looking at them, I think, in some sense, and he's saying, hey, your hearts are far from me. I'm flipping these tables as an indication that you are not worshiping me correctly. And ultimately, if you don't connect what's going on here in the temple with the flipping of these tables, with the fact that your hearts are far from me, you got to get your heart under control. If you're not doing that, this temple is going to have the same consequences it had back in Jeremiah and back in Shiloh, which happens in AD 70. So I think we see these symptoms and they're right. But he's ultimately saying, look at how you're treating my temple. It's symptomatic that you are not ultimately loving and caring for me as God above all gods.
Yeah, and I think what it really comes down to is their hearts are far from God because they're so distracted. And when they walk into the temple and all they're seeing are merchants everywhere, they're just getting further distracted, which is what makes Jesus so, he's weeping over Jerusalem because of their hearts being far from him. And so I just can't help but think, what is distracting us? You know, we don't worship in a temple, we worship in a church, which is a little bit different. But when we come to church on Sunday morning, what is distracting our hearts from worshiping God? And when we think about that, what can we say about Lent as a whole? You know, when we think about Lent, we think about, oh, we're giving something up. But how can we reframe that to consider how we can deepen our worship for God and lessen the distractions in our lives?
I think that's a great point. I think you're asking us, in effect, how we can have that same zeal for God's house that Jesus had. And what we usually think of, like you said, is giving something up. But what I see this passage reminding me to do, or asking me to do, is to find ways to keep that zeal moving in the right direction, to keep being zealous for the things of God. And so how each person does that, I think, is unique to each individual, of course. But I also think that's what's being called upon as we come into Lent, as we think about Lent, is to find what in our lives will really amp up our heart for God and the things of God, rather than what I can cut out. And it may be cutting out, which keeping me from doing that, but with the goal of making my heart like Jesus' heart. His heart was for people. His heart was for seeing God worshiped well and from a pure heart. And so how do we do that? We do that by the things that draw us closer to God. We read his word. We hear from him. We spend time with him. We fellowship with others in the body that are also trying to grow. It's why we're pursuing life in Christ together. It's also, how we view him in our day-to-day life. Do we enter into relationship with God when we're talking with other people? And do we invite him into that conversation, or are we on autopilot at that moment? Are we really being zealous for the things of God in our daily lives?
Yeah, it's really a call to seriousness. And that's what he's ultimately demonstrating with his zeal in the temple. And so as we approach Lent, as we approach any season and look at this text, we need to be comfortable saying God is our God, but then our lives need to match that. And so there are plenty of people that are even coming to church and reading their Bibles and praying and doing all of these things. But just like the religious leaders, their hearts are far from God. And so I think Lent, or I think this season, is an opportunity for us to kind of re-examine our lives and have a call to seriousness, which may even mean we're doing some of those things. But are we pausing and saying, have we actually given up our sin? Have we actually given up those things in our lives that are holding us back from who Christ is and how we should be reigning in our hearts? And I think we see that a lot with Israel, where they are doing the work and they're tithing mint and cumin and they're offering all of the small details of life up to God. They're very, very legalistic, but their hearts are far from God because they're continuing to offer sacrifices, but they don't actually care about the God behind the sacrifices. And so I would just encourage us to have a call to seriousness in this season and do some self-evaluation so that we aren't just comfortable saying God is our God, but not actually making sure our lives are in alignment with that claim.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm doing during this Lent season is I'm reading a book that's 40 days through the Gospel of John. And just last night, I was reading about how there's a difference between believing in something and binding your life to something. So binding your life to something is becoming a disciple. And even the demons believed and shuddered, but they weren't disciples of Jesus. They weren't binding their lives to Jesus. And so I think that's exactly what you're saying. Like, how can we take steps to become more like Jesus, to become disciples of Jesus? I'm curious for each of you, is there anything that you're doing in your own lives during this Lent season to take those intentional steps to further connect your heart with God's heart for us and for the world and for all of these things that we see in this passage?
Yes, but can I comment on something first?
Absolutely.
I see the fig tree come back into play here because it looked really good on the outside. There were leaves. It looked like a great fig tree. Jesus knew he wasn't going to find fruit on it, though, I think, but he goes to see if there's fruit in it. And so I just see that we can look really good on the outside, like we're pursuing life in Christ, like we're living as followers of Jesus, and not really have that heart attitude toward Christ and the things that make us real disciples. So I am part of a group of people that are praying for the Muslim world at this time. It coincides with Ramadan, and that has been something that has really been particularly special in my life as I connect with how God has a heart for the Muslim world. And so I always want to make a plug for praying for the Muslim world and the 30 days of praying through the Muslim world as well. But that just happens at this time of year to coincide with that heart that I need to see renewed for the world and praying for the world. So I have gone back to praying each day for an unreached people group that I have an app called the Joshua Project app that gives me an unreached of the day, and praying that way and allowing God to enrich my heart for the nations. And I think that's one of the messages that Jesus is giving when he's overturning the tables. It's about everybody else too. It's not just what you're comfortable with in your spiritual life. It's about looking outwardly at others as well. And so that's something that's been helping me personally. I always like that reminder to be renewed in my life of praying for and thinking about others.
It's cool that that's not a coincidence, that right. Ramadan and Lent kind of line up with each other.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, with the sovereign God, coincidence is probably a word we should never use. But yes, that
there you go.
It really is God at work to then remind us of how we need to be seeking others. And when the scriptures talk about bearing fruit, I think it's in one of two different ways. One way is the way that my character becomes more like Christ. I bear the fruit of the Spirit in my life. But the other way that the Bible talks about fruit is when other people come to know him, the fruit that we have in seeing people come into fellowship with Christ. And so I think sometimes we're content with one when the scriptures are really saying fruit bearing. Our fig tree can look good, but fruit bearing really involves also making sure the gospel is made known to other people.
Yeah, and for us in our young family context, we've got a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old. And so we've just been really focusing on, during this season, intentional times of family worship, building our way up toward Easter. And so trying to focus on that relational element that we're talking about here, where it's not just about doing family worship and reading and praying and singing like we do each night, but it's about helping to build that relationship with Christ. Why are we doing this? And so coupling that with prayers for things outside of ourselves and trying to help both us and our kids to see our time of prayer is not just for us, it's for other people. And so as we build relationship with God, that should cause us to love God and love others. And so to have that downstream flow. But we've kind of, in this season, trying to simplify that with a young family and kind of focus on the basics as we head into Easter.
Yeah. Well, I think I can speak on behalf of all three of us that it's our hope that sharing what we've been doing to kind of take steps towards the heart of Jesus will help to encourage those who are watching or listening in ways that they can take steps towards the heart of Jesus in this season. So thanks so much for taking some time to unpack this passage, to reflect and discuss. And we hope that it's encouraging to those who are tuning in. And we hope that you'll join us again next week as we continue to walk through Passion Week together.